there is something surprising and very bold at the heart of Christianity, the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Say more about that. Suppose somebody says, look, give me a break. That doesn't happen. I gather at one recent debate on this, someone brought in a nurse who had said, listen, you've been in hospitals, you've seen people die. Have they ever come back? And so on. And so how do you respond to the initial skepticism that someone may have of, how could that possibly be?
Well, the first thing to say is that people in the first century knew just as well as we do that dead people don't come back. If you read from Homer through Socrates to Plato to Pliny, whenever they mention the possibility of resurrection, they say, come on, as you say, give me a break. We know that doesn't. And the early Christians knew that just as well as we do. This is, again, part of this chronological snobbery thing. And this is a C.S. Lewis line about that. He says, people often imagine that the ancients didn't know the laws of nature and that we now that we have modern science, we do. And he said, apropos the virgin birth, the reason that Joseph was worried about Mary's pregnancy was not because he didn't know where babies came from, but because he did. And the same with the resurrection. The disciples were not going around saying, oh, well, isn't that interesting? So people sometimes come back from the dead. No, this was not one instance of what now appeared to be a new possible general rule or something. Far from it. Rather, and this is a place where people often get confused. As people say, oh, well, the Jews believed in resurrection, so when Jesus died, they naturally thought he'd come back. Well, no, some Jews, most Jews of the time, did believe in resurrection, but resurrection, they believed, was something that God would do for all his people at the end of time. Nobody ever imagined it would happen for one person in the middle. And you can test this because we know 100 years either side of Jesus, we know of several Jewish resistance movements, messianic movements, rebel movements. Routinely, they ended with the death of the founder. And we have in the histories of Josephus and so on, accounts of what happened next. If the man you followed, who you believe is the king, the new leader, the one God has sent, etc., if he gets killed, you have a choice. Either you give up the movement or you get yourself another leader. And we've got evidence of movements that do one or other of those things. In no case do we have people going around saying, actually, I think he's been raised from the dead. Because, they were more hard-headed than that. Life is real, we've got to get on with it. And in particular, the idea of choosing another leader, the leader of the church in Jerusalem throughout the next generation was James, who was Jesus' own brother. Now, it's very interesting because he was a great leader, a great teacher, a wonderful man of prayer, etc. But nobody ever said that James was the Messiah. If Jesus' body had stayed in the tomb, that would have been the natural thing. Well, it wasn't Jesus, too bad, but here's his brother. He's a great teacher. We revere him. And he was the man who was physically closest to this Jesus who sadly got crucified. So that would have exalted James, but they didn't. They called James the brother of Jesus, the brother of the Messiah. And so as a historian, I am forced to say, when I look at the rise of early Christianity and why it took the shape it did, there are all sorts of things which make me say, I cannot actually explain how Christianity got going as a renewal movement in Judaism in the first century, and why it took this specific shape, unless they really all did believe that Jesus was really bodily raised from the dead. And when you say, but why would they believe that? Could this have been a corporate hallucination or whatever? You can look at those arguments, and I've looked at them and I've written about them, and actually that doesn't work either. They knew about hallucinations, they knew about ghosts, they knew about odd, wacky experiences. There's plenty of literature about that in the ancient world. And they weren't so stupid as just to go wafting off on some idea like that. This was a very definite thing. He really has been raised from the dead. And that was why they did and said what they did.
I think one of the most remarkable passages is 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul says, look, a lot of the people here have actually witnessed these events. Yeah. There are more than 500 people who witnessed Jesus after his supposed death, and so go talk to them. Some of them have died, but look, a lot of people have, and this was close enough in time that you could still find these people.
Absolutely, absolutely. The passage there in Paul's letters, written probably in 52-3 AD, so roughly 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, and Paul is saying, as you say, more than 500, and most of them are still around, and the implication is, go and ask them. But there's another fascinating thing in that same passage, which is kind of interesting negative evidence, because what he's doing there is quoting an official church tradition, which goes like this, that the Messiah died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, he was raised from the third day according to the Scriptures, and was seen by. And then there's a list of people that he was seen by. And he was seen by Peter, by James, by all the apostles, by 500 at once, and last of all, Paul says, by me. And anyone who knows the early Christian stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, will say, something's odd about this. Because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, the first people to see the risen Jesus are the women. Now, what's happened is that in the official church tradition, already the women have been airbrushed out of the account, because the early church will have known that women were not regarded as credible witnesses in a law court. And already we have early evidence that people were sneering and saying, this is just a few hysterical women in the half-light of an early morning. You're not going to believe that, are you? And so already by the early 50s, the official tradition has lost sight of them. But in all four Gospels, and they're quite separate accounts, they're not verbally that similar, even when they're talking about the same thing, the women are front and center. And this is the point that I'm making. You would never, ever, ever have made that up. You know, either these stories go right back to the beginning, or they are complete crazy fantasies by people later on who are deliberately shooting themselves in the foot in terms of the credibility of the argument. So that 1 Corinthians 15 is important, but it's important partly as a sort of negative witness, throwing into relief the extraordinary fact that we have these four separate accounts in which the women are the first to see him.